The Barcelona airport terminal buzzed with travelers, but Margaret Chen sat motionless in her wheelchair, clutching her purse as waves of passengers flowed past her like water around a stone. Her son Daniel had told her to wait right here, that he was just going to exchange some currency and buy water for their flight home. That was 4 hours ago. She'd called his phone 37 times. Each call went straight to voicemail. Margaret was 72 years old, recovering from a hip replacement surgery she'd undergone just 3 weeks earlier. The trip to Spain had been Daniel's idea. A healing vacation, he'd called it, somewhere warm and beautiful where she could recover in comfort. He'd been so attentive at first, pushing her wheelchair through the Gothic quarter, helping her navigate the uneven cobblestones, translating for her at restaurants. But something had shifted in the last 2 days. He'd become distant, irritable. According to YouTube analytics, 99.6% of viewers are not subscribed. That's a huge number. By subscribing the channel that is completely free, you'll help support the channel and never miss fresh content. Yesterday, when she'd asked him about the strange phone calls he kept taking in hushed tones, he'd snapped at her for the first time in years. An airport security officer approached, speaking rapid Spanish. Margaret shook her head helplessly. "English! My son! He left me here. I don't know where." The officer's expression softened. Through broken English and hand gestures, he helped her understand that the terminal was closing for the night, that she needed to move. With his assistance, she made it to a bench near the information desk, where a kind woman named Rosa tried to help her figure out what to do. That's when Margaret checked her email on her phone, her arthritic fingers struggling with the small screen. There, sent just an hour ago, was a message from Daniel. "Mom, I'm sorry. I can't do this anymore. You have your passport and your credit cards. There's a hotel near the airport. I need to live my own life. I've spent years taking care of you, and I'm done. Don't try to contact me." The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. Rosa called the hotel, helped arrange transportation, stayed with her until Margaret was safely checked in. Through it all, Margaret felt numb, hollowed out. Her only child had abandoned her in a foreign country where she didn't speak the language, couldn't walk without assistance, and knew no one. That night, in a sterile hotel room that smelled of disinfectant and loneliness, Margaret didn't cry. Instead, she lay awake, her mind churning through the past year. Daniel's sudden interest in her finances. The papers he'd asked her to sign, which he said were just updates to your will, Mom, standard stuff. The way he'd insisted on managing her accounts after the surgery, claiming it would be easier for her. She pulled out her laptop, thank God she'd packed it, and logged into her bank account. Her hands trembled as the page loaded. The account that should have held $340,000 from her late husband's life insurance and her retirement savings showed a balance of $8,047. Margaret sat up so fast her hips screamed in protest. She clicked through transaction after transaction. Transfers to Daniel's account, payments to luxury car dealerships, expensive restaurants, a down payment on a condo in Miami. All dated over the past 6 months, all bearing her forged signature authorization. He hadn't just abandoned her, he'd been systematically robbing her. The numbness transformed into something cold and crystalline. Margaret had survived emigrating from Taiwan at age 23 with nothing but a suitcase and determination. She'd built a successful accounting practice, raised a son as a widow, put herself through night school for her CPA certification. She was not a woman who broke easily. Over the next 3 days, Margaret worked from that hotel room with a focus she hadn't felt in years. She contacted the bank, filed fraud reports, and hired a Spanish-speaking lawyer Rosa helped her find. But more importantly, she made other arrangements, ones that would require patience, planning, and a willingness to let Daniel believe he'd won. When she finally boarded a plane home to Chicago, traveling in a wheelchair with assistance arranged by the airline, she looked like a defeated old woman. She'd practiced that look in the mirror. Let Daniel think her broken. Let him think her helpless. She had work to do. Daniel Chen stood in the kitchen of his new Miami condo, champagne flute in hand, admiring the view of Biscayne Bay through floor-to-ceiling windows. Freedom tasted sweet. No more listening to his mother's endless stories about the old days. No more managing her medications, her doctor's appointments, her neediness. He'd done his time as the dutiful son, 20 years of it since his father died. Now, at 43, he finally had the life he deserved. His phone rang, an unknown Chicago number. He ignored it. It rang again and again. Annoyed, he answered. "What?" "Mr. Chen, this is Detective Michelle Cordero with the Chicago Police Department Financial Crimes Division. We need to speak with you about irregularities in your mother's financial accounts." Daniel's stomach dropped, but he kept his voice steady. "I don't know what you're talking about. My mother gave me access to her accounts to help her manage her affairs. She's elderly, recovering from surgery. Mr. Chen, we have evidence of systematic theft over 6 months. Your mother has filed a formal complaint, and we have documentation that suggests—" "This is ridiculous. My mother is confused. She probably doesn't even remember authorizing those transfers. Talk to her doctors. She's been on pain medication. She's not thinking clearly." "Actually, sir, your mother is quite clear. She's provided us with extensive documentation, including emails, recordings, and witness statements. We'd like you to come in voluntarily to discuss this matter." Daniel hung up and immediately called his mother's number. It went to a voicemail box that was full. He tried again. Same result. Over the next week, the calls escalated. Detective Cordero left increasingly firm messages. A lawyer sent a letter informing him of civil proceedings. But worse than any of that was the silence from his mother. He couldn't gauge what she knew, what she'd done, what she was planning. The uncertainty gnawed at him. 2 weeks after the first call from the detective, Daniel's anxiety had transformed into anger. His mother was trying to ruin him, trying to guilt him back into servitude. He decided to fly back to Chicago, to confront her directly, to remind her of everything he'd sacrificed for her. He would make her drop the charges, make her understand that he'd earned that money through years of unpaid labor as her caretaker. The flight to Chicago felt endless. Daniel rehearsed his arguments, his justifications. By the time the plane landed, he'd convinced himself he was the victim here. He took a taxi directly to his mother's house in Oak Park, the tidy brick bungalow where he'd grown up. He still had his key. She'd never asked for it back. He let himself in, calling out, "Mom, we need to talk. This has gone far enough." The house was silent. Daniel walked through the familiar rooms, noticing immediately that something was different. The furniture was gone, not all of it, but his mother's prized possessions. The jade collection his father had given her, the antique Chinese cabinet, the silk paintings. The house had been stripped of everything valuable. In the living room, he found a single envelope on the mantel, addressed to him in his mother's precise handwriting. Inside was a letter and a photograph. The photograph showed his mother standing without a wheelchair, without even a cane, in front of a beautiful Spanish-style house with a terracotta roof and blooming bougainvillea. She was smiling, her arm around Rosa, the woman from the airport. The letter read, "Daniel, you were right about one thing. I did need a change. Barcelona was lovely, even after you left me there. Rosa helped me see that sometimes the cruelest betrayals lead us to the biggest transformations. I've sold the house. I've liquidated all my remaining assets. The bank has frozen the accounts you stole from, and the fraud investigation is proceeding with or without your cooperation. I've given my testimony, provided all the evidence they need. Whether you go to prison is now up to the courts. But this letter isn't about revenge, not really. It's about clarity. I spent 3 days alone in that Barcelona hotel, Daniel. 3 days thinking about how I'd devoted my entire life to you after your father died. I worked myself to exhaustion to pay for your college, your graduate school, your failed business ventures. I never remarried, never pursued my own dreams, because I told myself that being your mother was enough. And it was. Until I realized you saw me as an ATM, not as a person, not even as your mother, really, but as an obstacle to your real life. The hip surgery? I didn't need it as urgently as I claimed. But I wanted to see if you still cared, if you'd show up for me the way I always showed up for you. You did show up, Daniel, but only to get me to sign papers that made you my power of attorney. Only to position yourself to steal everything I'd spent 50 years building. That lawyer you sent me to? I hired my own, who found all the forged authorizations, all the fraudulent transfers. You weren't as clever as you thought. So yes, I've left. Not just the house, but the country. I'm writing this from my new home in Barcelona, where Rosa and her family have welcomed me with a kindness you never showed. I'm taking Spanish lessons. I'm getting physical therapy from a wonderful doctor who's helped me realize my mobility issues were as much from depression as from age. I'm learning to paint. I'm meeting people who see me as Margaret, not as someone's elderly burden. The money you stole? Most of it's been recovered and is now in protected accounts you can never touch. The house sale? That money is mine too, already transferred to my Spanish bank. I've left you exactly what you left me in that airport. Nothing but the consequences of your choices. I hope it was worth it, Daniel. I hope those luxury cars and that condo bring you the happiness you were so desperate to find. I hope they fill the hole where your conscience used to be. I won't press criminal charges beyond what I've already done. Not to be kind to you, but because I want to be free of you entirely. Whether the state pursues charges is their decision. I've said my piece. You wanted to live your own life, free from the burden of me. Congratulations. You've succeeded completely. Don't contact me. Don't try to find me. As far as I'm concerned, I no longer have a son. I had one once. I raised him to be better than this. But that boy is gone, if he ever existed at all. Goodbye, Daniel. Margaret Chen. Daniel read the letter 3 times, his hands shaking. He walked through the empty house in a daze, room after room, stripped of everything that had made it a home. His childhood bedroom, where his mother had stayed up countless nights nursing him through illnesses, was bare except for a single box. Inside the box were photographs, his entire childhood, documented in meticulous detail. Birthday parties she'd thrown on her tiny budget, science fair projects she'd helped him build, his college graduation, her face glowing with pride, his father's funeral, where she'd stood strong while Daniel fell apart, promising him she'd take care of everything. And she had. She'd taken care of everything, always. At the bottom of the box was one more item, the Mother's Day card he'd given her when he was 8 years old. Construction paper and crayon, with the words, "You're the best mom in the world. I love you forever." Daniel sat on the floor of the empty house and finally understood what he'd done. Not just the theft, that was merely money, but the deeper betrayal, the way he'd reduced his mother to an inconvenience, a source of funds, an obstacle between him and the life he wanted. He tried calling her number 1 more time. It was disconnected. He searched for her online, looking for any trace of her in Barcelona, but found nothing. She'd vanished as thoroughly as his childhood, as his conscience, as the man he'd promised that 8-year-old boy he would become. 2 months later, Daniel sat in a courtroom as the judge read the verdict in the civil case. The state had indeed pursued criminal charges, but his lawyer had managed to negotiate a plea deal: restitution, probation, community service, but no jail time. The condo in Miami had been seized to pay the restitution. The car was sold. He was, essentially, broke. But the real punishment wasn't the lost money or the criminal record. It was knowing that somewhere in Barcelona, his mother was living a life she'd never had the chance to live before. A life without him. A life she'd discovered only after he'd shown her, in the cruelest way possible, that she deserved better than a son who saw her as a burden. Daniel moved into a small apartment on the outskirts of Chicago, got a job doing data entry, and lived with the weight of his choices. Every Mother's Day, he thought about sending her a card, an apology, something. But he never did. She'd asked him not to contact her. It was the first time in years he'd actually respected her wishes. In Barcelona, Margaret Chen sat at a cafe in the Gracia neighborhood, speaking halting but improving Spanish with her language partner, a retired professor named Antonio. The morning sun was warm on her face. Her hip, strengthened through consistent therapy and daily walks, barely bothered her anymore. Rosa joined them, bringing pastries and laughter, telling a story about her grandson that made them all smile. Margaret had become a regular fixture in Rosa's extended family, a beloved tia to the children, a confidant to the adults. She'd started a small consulting business, using her accounting expertise to help other expats navigate Spanish financial systems. She volunteered at a center for elderly people, teaching English, sharing stories, listening to theirs. She'd taken up watercolor painting and discovered she had a talent for capturing the play of light on Barcelona's distinctive architecture. Sometimes, late at night, she thought about Daniel, not with anger, that had burned away months ago, but with a kind of sad bewilderment. How had she raised someone capable of such callousness? Where had she gone wrong? But mostly, she didn't think about him at all. She thought about her next painting class, about the trip to Seville she was planning with Rosa, about the grandmotherly role she'd assumed with Rosa's family, about the book club she'd joined, about the widower Antonio, who sometimes looked at her with an interest that both terrified and thrilled her. She thought about the future, something she'd stopped doing in those years when she'd defined herself solely through her son. One evening, as she sat on the small balcony of her apartment, watching the sunset paint the city in shades of gold and rose, Margaret raised a glass of wine in a private toast. "To betrayals that set us free," she whispered to the Barcelona sky, "and to the lives we find when we finally stop waiting for other people to give us permission to live them." The city murmured its approval in 100 different languages, in the laughter of children playing in the street below, in the distant sound of someone playing guitar, in the warm breeze that carried the scent of jasmine and the sea. Margaret smiled, took a sip of wine, and turned back to the canvas waiting on her easel. She had a painting to finish, a life to live, and a son to forget. And for the first time in decades, she had something she'd never quite had before, herself, wholly and completely her own. The revenge she'd taken wasn't in the legal proceedings or the seized assets, or even the dramatic letter. It was in this, living well, living fully, living as though Daniel's abandonment had been not a tragedy, but a liberation. Because in the end, it had been exactly that. And somewhere in a small Chicago apartment, Daniel was learning the same lesson, from the other side. That some prices can't be measured in money, that some debts can never be repaid, and that the cruelest punishment isn't what others inflict on us, but what we inflict on ourselves when we realize, too late, what we've thrown away. Margaret didn't know if her son ever had that realization, and she'd made peace with never knowing. She had her own life to live now, and she intended to live every last moment of it.